Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Today, we'll be reading Chapter 7 of The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. The chapter starts off with a quote. "We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our way through the blood of the slaughtered." The title of this chapter is The Scattering of the People, Routes to Death and Resurrection. I am part of a podcasting network.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
The Scattering of the People, Routes to Death and Resurrection. The African migrations have been stressed at various points as one of the major developments from which so much can be learned about the history of the Black people. The migrations explain many things. They were people with perpetual movements. The movements were human tragedies spanning too many millenniums. It was noted that the great pressures on the Africans actually began in prehistoric times, and that the pressures that uprooted so many settled communities came from two principal agents of destruction: the slow and relentless incursions of oceans and sand, so the nature, and the slow, relentless incursions of Asian hordes. The Europeans coming later accelerated the movements. Migrations as culture declines. The migrations were of many different kinds, and so much so that the overall description of them is often misleading. There was no general, continuous flight of people here and there all over the continent. Some of the movements were so slow and limited in space that one might hesitate to call them migrations. These were the groups that moved only a relatively short distance each time, and as a whole, they never left the general area. After 100 years, such groups might not be more than 100 miles from their traditional home after several generations. Even in cases of those who migrated farthest, the movement had been slow. Slow because the whole movement was forced. Every breakup a painful uprooting of communities that had been built on hopes and dreams of a permanent abode. Every move was a search for still another abode where land and water could support life and security could assure another chance of survival. These slow-moving migrations were mentioned in the discussion of geographical influences. There were also the better-known migrations that erupted and moved south, east, and west like tidal waves. These occurred as the result of many Asian and European invasions and conquests. They were further accelerated by the new turn in the institution of slavery from the 7th century AD onward. At a much later period, after the 16th century, Black marauding groups, such as the Jaga and the Ngongi, added to the turmoil and disorganization. It is quite clear that the many waves of Blacks that spread over Africa in these migrations came mainly from the area where Black concentration was the greatest, and the attacks on that concentration persevered relentlessly. This area of Black concentration of population was the ancient Ethiopian Empire, which I have described as the heartland of the race. The motherland with a civilization that, despite all the Asian invasions, still included all Upper Egypt in 3100 BC, and extended southward over the Sudan across Abyssinia. But everywhere the people from the birthplace of Black civilization wandered, they found, almost without exception, people already settled, some having preceded them by decades or centuries, and others who had been there according to their ancestors' story since the beginning of time. Such, for example, was the tradition of the Kete and Kwa people in Central Africa. The intertribal wars and intense tribalism that developed from them are among the fateful outcomes cited in connection with the migrations. I have stated it a number of times that inevitably there were non-Blacks in the migrations as they were, in one way or another, integrated with Africans and participated with them in other developments. This meant that there were always a number of predominantly Black groups with some Asians and mulattoes who were as loyal to the race as any Black. This is the kind of fact that blasts any attempt to indict a whole people or put them into a single category. Human beings simply refuse to be generalized into neat categories. In ancient times, and even later, there were Caucasians who regarded the Blacks as superior people. The question about inherent inequality they would have thought absurd to entertain. The Greeks, who seem to have studied the advanced civilization of the Blacks more than any other white people, were the first among this group. There were therefore always Caucasians who were affectionately drawn to the Blacks as by some magic. They recognized as genuine by the Blacks, the esteem became mutual, and such Caucasians became an integral part of some Black groups. These were not the Caucasians, Asians, or Westerners who infiltrated Black societies for domination and future conquest. These were the Caucasians, albeit a small minority, who stayed with the Blacks and fought shoulder to shoulder with them against their own kind, retreated with them in defeat, and were therefore a part of the migrations. I have also emphasized that not all of the mixed breeds, whether Afro-Arab or Afro-European, deserted the Blacks for the whites. For a while, the majority did cleave to the race of their fathers. The devotion of the minority to the race of their mothers seemed to be so spiritual in nature that it more than overshadowed the white-worshiping half-whites. what he's saying here is that not all mixed breed foreigners, mulattoes, interrace people, mixed breed people, interracial people are bad. We intellectually know that, but in a world where white people and non-Black people try to dominate and control everything, we have to have our guard up at all times. Because if we don't have our guard up at all times, their usual pattern is to come and socially and sexually integrate into a society so that they can get into the power structure or connect to those people who have the most resources and take those resources out of the community. Greetings, Pro Black Perspective. I'm so glad you're here. Um, so as we have seen, even Chancellor Williams falls prey to the not all white people are bad, because he found examples of Afro-Arab, Afro-European, whites, blacks, Asians, Arabs, Europeans, Caucasians, whatever you want to call them. He found examples in his research of others that seemed to have an allegiance to the Black race. But what was their true motive? Because everywhere this mixing bowl effect of people occurred, or this melting pot occurred, Black winds up on the bottom. And so, because we know that anecdotally, Black winds up on the bottom, we live that anecdotally. So, because I'm saying it anecdotally, because we don't have all of the evidence from every single person that ever lived. But we know that anecdotally in mainstream society, if Black exists in a society with others, Black winds up on the bottom. Then we know that this mixing and these multiracial people and these others and foreign outsiders are not good for Black civilization, because they integrate socially and sexually into the power structure and they wind up on top. So in this, I disagree with Chancellor Williams where he says that we can't throw them all out. We can throw them all out because we have enough evidence that shows that they do what they do and they are ensuring their survival. It is our job to ensure our survival. White scholars as authorities. And what has all this to do with the migrations? The answer is almost everything. Much of the history of Africa has been written by anthropologists. They have written it within the theoretical framework of their own ethnology, and historians and others have relied almost entirely on their classification of peoples. The usual claim that the history of science is made despite the amount of pure guessing that characterizes its conclusions. Race is so obvious in most of the anthropological findings that one may wonder how, if they hope to maintain the fiction of being scientific, it could escape their notice. How could race in and of itself escape the notice of these scientists if they're trying to remain scientific? It had been suggested that their biases does not in fact go unnoticed, but that they are so certain of the favorable reception, excuse me, of the favorable reception by the white audience to which they address themselves, that what others outside of that world think is a matter of consequence. The latter do not supply millions that support their African studies. The main thrust of their findings is to make Africa Caucasian from the beginning of its history and to give to the Blacks not just a subordinate role, but no significant role at all in history. Hence, their great emphasis on 1, the Caucasoid identity of this or that African tribe, 2, failing that in a highly advanced all-Black situation, there were no such classification that could be made to allege Caucasian influence in one way or another. This record does not require debate. It meets the eyes in most of the books by these Africanist experts. There should be no confusion over Negroid types or Caucasoid types. Where there was such a widening mixing of races was the case in Africa and elsewhere from the earliest of times. It becomes even more ridiculous when it is established that certain Caucasians have so-called Negroid features without the benefit of having any Negro blood. And conversely, many of the blackest of the blacks have physical characteristics which are supposed to belong to Caucasians only. Greetings, Sister Ra. Thank you so much for the gift. In line with their presumption in taking over the continent and reordering the racial composition, the anthropologists and their historian followers have declared that the so-called true Negroes or Black Africans are concentrated in West Africa only. With the wave of the magic wand in their all-powerful scientific hand, with the wave of their magic wand in their all-powerful so-called scientific hand, they changed the biblical story that the Black race descended from Ham through the son of Cush. The plain fact that the land of Cush was ancient Ethiopia itself and that the Cushites, no matter how you spell it, were blacks was simply ignored. The Cushites were classified as Caucasians. The whites and half-whites who were allied with Black groups and migrated with them are singled out as the determining elements in whatever the groups achieved, even in the planting of crops and irrigation techniques. The Asiatic Caucasians, who are known to have settled along the northern and eastern coast of Africa, even in prehistoric times, are now being presented as indigenous inhabitants. That archaeologists could find so-called Caucasoid types centuries old in any of these areas should be taken as a simple matter of course. Nor would I think it surprising if excavation discovered Caucasoid skeletons several thousand years old anywhere in Africa. The same unshocked attitude is maintained when quote unquote Negroid types were discovered on the British Isles. Indeed, Negroid remains have been found in other places in Europe and distant lands where no blacks were known to have lived, not to mention the millions known to have settled outside of Africa. Therefore, instead of postulating a theory of history that on the basis of a few skeletal remains, a whole people inhabited an area first, it would be more sensible to conclude that members of this or that race certainly had visited or settled in the area in the long ago, some dying there, away from their own native land. But suppose they did come as permanent settlers, such as the Dutch in South Africa and the British in Rhodesia. The whites of South Africa are not waiting for the certain verdict of anthropologists and historians in their favor. They already claim to be the original inhabitants, saying as George Peter Murdoch and his school proclaimed that the Africans came into the land later. 1,000 years hence, there will be no dearth of Caucasoid remains in Africa. I just referred to George Peter Murdoch. Although all through these discussions, I have been unsparing in my criticism of Caucasoid scholarship at various points. I have, in effect, accused them of the subtle thievery of the achievements of an important division of the human race, deliberate and unconscionable. To understand, excuse me, sorry about that. To understand the basis for this criticism, One need not match my labor by wading through over 100 books by them. One good example of all that I have been saying in this connection will suffice. That example is Murdoch's Africa, Its People and Their Culture. Here is another one of those works which is replete with all the trappings of profound scholarship, bearing, as all such works invariably do, the mark of scientific objectivity. Yet from the beginning to the end, Murdoch maintains his central theme. Africans are not in fact Africans. Black civilization was not in fact Black civilization. Countless peoples, thought to be Negroes by many, such as the Bushmen, the Maasai, the Cushites, the Pygmy, even the Bantu, etc., are of Caucasoid origins, according to Murdoch. And while his own account of migrations over often contradicts his main thesis, this, I suppose, he dismisses as simply unavoidable. He was, at his racist best, in a specious and rather amusing argument that attempted to prove that even the Tanzanians were not Black. Is it not significant that so many white writers spend so much time and energy trying to make this or that person or group non-African? Certain direct consequences of the migrations will not be fully understood unless the many centuries they slowly covered are kept in mind. The development and spread of the numerous languages, dialects, separate and independent small city-states from which varieties of cultural patterns inevitably emerged, these outcomes highlight the factors of segmentation in the decline of advanced Black institutions. But migrations from the first centers of Black culture in the Sudan and Egypt also had beneficial results. Give me one moment, you guys. Take a listen to this. I'm getting a call. I apologize.
Hello there, dear listener. We hope you're enjoying this lovely discussion. If you're not already aware, this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio, a Pan-African nationalist and Garveyite network committed to showcasing the rich and varied thoughts of African people. We have an exciting lineup of shows that we think you'll enjoy, including
the Bitter Medicine Podcast.
I think Black people acquire too much buy-in. Like, we constantly have to sell Black people on things that are beneficial to Black people.
The Pro-Black Perspective Podcast.
I'm fearful that our people are not really studying how to get ahead, and we're kind of, continually staying behind.
The Harsh Reality Podcast.
To me, it don't matter. I think people are so dumbed down, it wouldn't matter what you reveal to them. They still are in the matrix. They're in the simulation. They're going to keep doing what they did. They lemmings. So to me, it don't matter, man.
The Learning Curve Podcast.
Sexual access has never given you economic empowerment. The only person who has ever been economically empowered by a sexual relationship is the wasp and his woman.
The Cathedra Cheek Show.
When we start rising up to fight for our own, I guarantee you they'll stop doing what they're doing. I guarantee you they would have let their brother go. They was waiting to see what Black folks was going to do.
Brother Bakari Podcast.
Black people love to claim folks that hate them, right? They're a slave master, and they are ashamed of who they really are.
The Forecast Radio.
Like if you pray to the same deity as like your enemy, and that God blesses your enemy more than you may want to reconsider who you praying to, you know.
And Tanzan, African Mind.
Africans generally are welcoming of everyone. Sometimes, to my consternation, I think that they should be less, welcoming.
If you love our podcast network, we would be grateful if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on social media, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and check out our website at www.kwazradio.com for more information. Thank you for tuning in. And now, back to the program.
Is it not significant that so many white writers spend so much time and energy trying to make this or that person or group non-African? Certain direct consequences of the migrations will not be fully understood unless the many centuries they slowly covered are kept in mind. The development and spread of the numerous languages, dialects, separate and independent small city-states. You guys are going to have to hold on for a minute.
Hello there, dear listener. We hope you're enjoying this lovely discussion. If you're not already aware, this show is part of a podcast network called KWAZ Radio, a Pan-African nationalist and Garveyite network come to showcasing the
Can you hear me? Hello? I'm sorry, can you hear me? All right. I'm sorry, guys. I had a family situation happening. My brother is moving to Georgia, and so he was in the midst of getting me some information. So I may be relocating as well. I live in Michigan. It would be a good thing for me to move to a warmer climate. Certain direct consequences of the migrations will not be fully understood unless the many centuries they slowly covered are kept in mind. The development and spread of the numerous languages, dialects, separate and independent small city-states from which varieties of cultural patterns inevitably emerged. These outcomes highlight the factors of segmentation in the decline of the advanced Black institutions. But migrations from the first centers of Black culture in the Sudan and Egypt also had beneficial results. The migrants were a new kind of missionary. They carried whatever they could of their advanced civilization wherever they went, and they carried it far and wide. The backward groups that had been living far away from the centers of progress were the beneficiaries. An economic revolution occurred in areas where the Nile migrants not only brought new grain crops, but also new implements and farming techniques. They also spread the gospel of industrial production through the expansion of crafts and their organization into guilds. The greatest of these was iron. For iron, all by itself, created the greatest industrial revolution in Africa and became at once both the catalyst for the foundation of the new state formations and expansion of power. In like manner, basic African institutions, such as the traditional constitutional and social systems, were reinforced by the migrations from the heartland. And while many of these basic institutions were influenced and modified by Islam and Christian Europe, they all remain so unyielding at the core that they can be studied today almost as directly as they could have been 5,000 years ago. There is another fact in this connection that is not pointed out often and never stressed. We generally speak glibly enough about Asian and Western influence on Black Africa, but seldom about the influence of Africa on Asian and Western institutions. The process of Africanization began at once whenever and wherever the Blacks came in contact with foreign institutions. Both Islam and Christianity had to yield to Africanization. Even autocratic sultans and emirs, all powerful in Asia, clashed head on with the constitutional role of the council in Africa, and they had to yield. The religions that spread most rapidly and widely were those which were readily adaptable to African cultural patterns. Islam and the Catholic Church led in this, and the Catholic Church outdistanced every other Christian denomination in growth. A large volume should be written on the African influence on both Asian and Western civilization, since that influence began in ancient times, was not limited to Caucasians on the African continent, but was carried to other lands by migrating whites who themselves had been Africanized. African values did not die even among the millions of slaves who were transplanted to distant lands. In the United States, where the system to stamp out every vestige of Black culture was most thoroughgoing and relentless, African traditions persisted and influenced not only the white slave owning class, but the course of American civilization itself. The historical significance of the movement of people, no matter under what circumstances, can hardly be overemphasized. We have seen how and why the flight of Blacks from the Sudan increased as the Arab hordes continued to sweep in during the 13th century and Islamization was more aggressively pushed. Too many Blacks leaving their homeland, what was happening was far worse than the sight of their cities, towns, and villages going up in flames. For now they saw their very own leaders, kings and other notables, divesting themselves of a tradition of civilization that went back beyond history into Paleolithic times, and for expedience or self interest were humbly grasping at the robes of the Arabs, their language, and their religion. Their leaders on the throne were no longer Africans or Ethiopians. They were now of still another race. They were Black Arabs. Greetings, Forecast. How are you tonight? So it did not matter at all that the new states were forming under Black Arab rule. The Arabs not only tolerated these Black Muslim rulers, sultans and emirs they were now called, but found it expedient to use them as fronts in controlling the remaining Black population. The real rulers were the various Arab tribes that were now scattered all over the Sudan. So can you imagine before your very eyes, your king bowing down to some foreigner and giving over all control and power and resources to them, whether it was for fear or whether it was just placating or whether they thought they were making a good business deal, and you see your civilization slipping away before your very eyes to these Black Arabs? Greetings, Black Magus. How you doing today? There was a great difference between these new Black Muslim states and the Funj, F-U-N-J. While Funj was also a sultanate in name, it had a long line of Black rulers who steadfastly refused to be Arabized, even to the extent of accepting Arab names. And even the Arab population knew very well that the Muslim religion of those Black sultans was very superficial indeed. The new fringe states of Darfur, Wadai, and others under Black Muslims offered no place or refuge for those whose very reason for flight was to maintain their own racial identity, dignity, and religion. The Saharan tragedy. We return to the Sahara again, for here is where the first Black migrations began before written history. Sahara or wasteland indicates what it became, not what it was. It was the largest northern region of Bildad as Sudan, the land of the Blacks. Viewing the vast area for at least 5,000 years, it is difficult to believe that it was not forever thus. But the Sahara, far bigger than the United States, was once a land of lakes, rivers, forests, green fields, farms, villages, towns, and cities. Wildlife was abundant. Cattle grazed in meadows, and horse-drawn chariots sped over the highways. It was a great land, yet only a part of an ever greater Black world. We have already noted that this Black African world had been under relentless pressures from the seacoast by invading whites from the earliest of times. Hebrews, Phoenicians, Mongols, Arabs, Berbers, Greeks, Romans, all of them. It was also pointed out that it is not without significance that even today, most of these invaders occupy the same areas where they came in, the seacoast. And Onitase talked to us about this, that, there are some places in Africa that's on the interior where you don't see white people. He drove for, I think he said, 18 hours. And he said, when you go 18 hours into a continent, you don't see white people. They are not there. And I think that that's beautiful. But around the seacoast, around the edges where There's access to trade and commerce and additional technology and where people can settle. There are a lot of multiracial people claiming that land as their own. For centuries, these whites must have been received with the traditional African hospitality. They were immigrants, settlers, and traders. Many, like the early blacks themselves, were seafaring men. That the blacks were once among the most adventurous of peoples is evidenced not only by the presence of their descendants in many lands and numerous far-flung lands, but also by the archaeological remains found in various parts of Europe. It seems clear, therefore, that the whites were not regarded as invaders with ulterior motives, but as co-partners in the further development of world trade. There was no obvious reason to think otherwise. No particular significance was seen in the fact that the whites always massed along the seacoast and built their towns and trading post strongholds there. The blacks were also in these same coastal areas. There was a general mixing or amalgamation of the races, which is a problem for us. From the earliest of times, in this area, the offspring of blacks and white Berbers and Arabs came to be known as Moors, Tuaregs, Tipu, and the Fulani. Like Afro-Americans, they were of every conceivable complexion, some of the whitest having quote-unquote Negro blood. The scientists in Africa, however, classify even the dark-skinned in these groups as Caucasoid. It does not appear that any black prophets came forth to warn the trusting African people that over 3 million square miles of their fertile land would be made a vast wasteland by slowly moving sandstorms from the north, or that even fleeing their lives would likewise be made a vast wasteland by the white storms from the seacoast. The sandstorms at first began their long, relentless rampage over hundreds of miles, but only as previous deforesting and the disappearance of grassland made this easy. The desiccation began far back in time, probably during a period after quaternary times had begun. Quaternary times began. No one knows how long that awful process of drying up lakes and rivers lasted. What is crystal clear is that during the ensuing migrations, the blacks made their greatest and most tragic error. It was an error to be fraught with the direst historical consequences for the whole black race. Instead of moving en masse to the seacoast and maintaining the dominant position there, which they could have done easily, they moved en masse toward the interior, first to the remaining oases in the desert, and then into northern and southern Ethiopia, Egypt, and the Sudan today, and to the south, central, and western regions. The Berbers, Arabs, and their Afro-Asian offspring, who were the Moors, the Tuaregs, etc., now firmly held the entire northern, northwestern, and eastern seaboard of Africa. The pro-black perspective says, yeah, the interior is ideal. He said, just like when you go to Jamaica, if you go by tourist area, you'll see more whites, but in the interior, it's black for real. Probably the same in the United States. When them say that Caucasoids, them say me crazy, seem. Raw, nobody is saying that you're crazy. They are Caucasoids, and they are a different breed. This tremendous victory of the white man was not achieved by conquest. It was achieved by default on the part of a race too preoccupied with the immediate present and less with its future. He's talking about us. We were too preoccupied with running from the sandstorms, the Asian invasions, the incursions, the intermixed people, and the ever changing landscape of the continent right now, and we were not concerned with our future. A race whose centuries of blind trust in the white man surpassed all understanding. One might say that in surrendering all of their coastal areas to the Asians and mulattoes, apparently without a fight except in the case of Lower Egypt, that the blacks not only sealed themselves off from world commerce and general international relations, but they also, at the same time, sealed their own fate to be hemmed in and surrounded hunting ground for slaves, on a hunting ground for slaves. The pattern for Egypt and Axum was clear-cut. Their story was already outlined early enough and so clearly that even the blind could not be aware of the shape of things to come. That shape emerged in their present. The whites were aggressive, always relentlessly pushing for a command position in every situation, no matter how small their number or how insignificant the project. The blacks, by contrast, were not so aggressive, tending toward the brotherhood approach, and generally striking only in retaliation for prior wrongs done. This overall humane and essentially religious attitude of the blacks led Arnold Toynbee to say that mankind may have to emulate them if civilization is to be saved. This is hardly a compliment in a world where the very meaning of civilization is lost. In the face of the Caucasian will to power and domination, this religion of meekness is a tacit surrender to the permanent overlordship of the aggressive and the strong. What he's saying is that we need to change our ways. We need to do something different so that we are not totally overwrought by these people that have a will to power and domination. This is the testimony of history, and perhaps this is why I have always been puzzled by the declaration of Jesus Christ that the meek would inherit the earth. Did he mean the grave? The quote-unquote pattern referred to above developed from the fact that countless thousands of blacks did not migrate anywhere but remained among the Asians. They gradually became the lowest class in their society, although there was only mobility or escape routes. The Berbers and Arabs constituted the upper class and ruling group. Next came the Afro-Berbers and Afro-Arabs, both of which are mulattoes, also classed as white. But in a class below whites, and finally there were still lower the class of blacks, and strangely enough, all Berbers, Arabs, and mixed breeds who chose to cast their lot with the blacks and share in their destiny. I said strangely enough, but was really nothing strange about it. It was simply a human situation. A part of the explanation was that out of the centuries of intermarriage, there had developed a network of family and kinship relationships. But it meant much more than these kinship ties. These whites and half-whites, admittedly a small minority, nevertheless did not have themselves classified as blacks, giving up the open opportunity to direct power, fame, and fortune. Like the majority of whites and half-whites with similar ties to blacks, they could have easily cut those ties and even denied that they had any ties. That was the easy way, the self-serving and expedient way. They refused to take it and chose to share all the hardships of the blacks. I dwell on this because here we catch the fleeting glimpse of progress of the human spirit as it emerged on a plane above the rewards of materialism and self-interest. I dwell on it because wherever this small group exists in a world gone mad with greed, there will remain some faint hope for a more humane world in the next 1,000 years. He's saying that these mixed race people, some of them decided to stay with the Black people. Some of them decided to identify with Black people, whether it was for family kinship or expediency. They cast their lot in with the Black people that they knew had a greater glory and a glorious past. But he's holding on to the hope that this small remnant of people will continue to make an impact on the world and change their Caucasian brethren to have some additional empathy, I guess, for Black people. It's not going to happen, not in our lifetimes. We're the ones that have to do it. We have to be more self-preserving. Self-preservation is a law of nature, and if we don't get it, and if we don't understand that, then we're going to be overtaken like we are today. Social and economic mobility came from the circumstances that the Blacks made up the strongest contingents of the Berber and Arab armies. Some became commanders, others became chief counselors to the sultans. Most males were castrated, however, or removed from any possible contact with all females. An equally significant group was the labor force of enslaved Blacks. These were highly important because they relieved the white Asians from all labor. The Blacks who were skilled craftsmen in various fields fared better since they were generally spared from the whip. The plight of the Blacks in white-dominated areas, including their enslavement, would have been different if the masses had not scattered in small groups over the trackless Sahara, the Nile Valley, Ethiopia, and other regions of the continent. The others referred to were the Blacks who remained where they were as their once vast and fertile homeland slowly turned into the Sahara or wasteland. Geologists, archaeologists, and other specialists have all advanced various theories to explain the great mystery of the transforming Sahara. We need not retell their interesting story here, for every explanation seems to project still another puzzling question, for me at any rate. For example, just how did the Albion Sea, a vast inland body of water as large as France, disappear in the Sahara? How many cities and towns lie buried under those mountains of sand and rocks? We know that in a given area, all farms, orchards, and even villages could be completely covered over with the sand in a matter of weeks. The fierce winds whipped up walls of sand and gravel like mountainous ocean waves. Since the region is over 1,000 miles wide and more than 3,000 miles from east to west, most of the people in the interior must have perished in their villages, farms, lakes, and rivers. The exceptions were those lucky people whose farms and villages escaped inundation by the moving oceans of sand. In these places of refuge, later called oases, the otherwise indiscriminate forces of death and destruction did indeed discriminate. Sometimes, high walls of sand began to pile up just before reaching these sites, leaving them safely in the valleys thus formed. These continued to be the centers of life and hope as the years passed on into our own times. And it is not without significance that 2/3 of the Sahara population today is still Black. Like their ancestors, they continued to be settled in communities of farmers, craftsmen, the kind of communities where civilization itself is born. But also, like their ancestors and all other advanced peoples, they were vulnerable to the wide-ranging, camel-riding Berber and Arab nomads. We don't have any friends, guys. These tent-dwelling raiders gained absolute control of all the trans-Saharan trade routes, with their kinsmen in control of all the commercial seaports. They had effective control over the economic life of Africa and therefore Africa itself. Did you hear that? If you have control over the economic life of Africa, in effect, you have control over Africa itself. That's still true to this day. If you have economic control of a society, you can dictate who people trade with and who they have access to. You have control of that society. The matter of making that control more complete by raiding and enslaving the blacks in scattered oasis communities became relatively easy. Direct contacts with Europe and Asia meant the possession of the latest superior weapons, which the blacks were unable to secure, firearms. And you'll hear many people to this day talking about the fact that the gun was the great leveler when it came to the destruction of Black civilization. We had known how to work iron, but we were always migrating and we weren't staying in place to fight. We were going further into the interior. Then we had the landscape working against us. Then we had this group and class of people that were mixed into our population that were probably carrying secrets back and forth in between our villages and the villages of the invaders. So there was a lot going on. Ethnology and the migrations. The great story of the Sahara is yet to be told. Archaeology has hardly ever scratched the surface beneath which a lost civilization lies buried under several thousand feet of sand and rocks. How far westward did the effective rule of the ancient empire extend? How many kingdoms were there? And by what African names were they known? What fringe states, such as ancient Ghana, that were found fighting for survival on the edges of the desert, once a part of a vast imperial system? There is some evidence that this may have been the case, but the actual fact remains unknown and speculation becomes an idle pastime. What is known is that the migrations from the Sahara, while heavily concentrated in Upper Egypt and the Eastern Sudan, also spread out over Africa in and through the Western Sudan. I may seem to have overemphasized the ethnic composition of some migrating groups by repeatedly referencing it. But it is so important that white historians have bypassed it in order to establish a new theory of prehistoric Caucasian occupation in Africa. Have they not found supposedly Caucasoid remains and artifacts in different places? According to this theory, the whites, in their conquest of Africa, were simply returning to their original homeland. But where now is the homeland of the blacks? Our Africanist experts do not know. Some few, apparently seeing how ridiculous it was to corner into which they had painted themselves, suggest that perhaps the blacks migrated from India or somewhere in Europe. Others undertake to establish Caucasian priority in Africa by excavating structures which no Negroes could have built. An example is a prehistoric site in Uganda. They found what seems to have been a well-built fortification of earthwork, reservoirs, dams for irrigation, trenches, and pit dwellings. All this indicated the mass organization and skills of a superior people, such as the Sidamo, for example. Nowhere in East Africa, the author concludes, are Negro peoples, either Bantu or Nilotic, known to have built structures even remotely comparable to these. This, like 1,000 similar false statements about Africans, requires no answer. The facts are now well known. But let us not miss the central point in all this. The Sidamo people, cited by this anthropologist as the probable builders of those structures, are themselves Black Africans, as Black and as African as are the anthropologist's Bantu and Nilotic groups. I have lived among all three groups. Some of the people in each group are of mixed blood, as a simple matter of course, just as American Blacks are mixed. But their pathological drive to prevent any concepts of unity from emerging in Africa, Caucasian scholars have been relentless in dividing the Blacks of Africa into numerous ethnic categories. This grand stage was designed to make each group feel unique, special, and hostile to all other groups. The development of different languages in the scattered and isolated societies was the most favorable situation for the division of the Blacks and the furtherance of hostility among them. None of this was evil deliberately designed. The writing of the history, or rather non-history, of non-Caucasians from a Caucasian viewpoint was a development of relatively recent times. It followed logically from the 19th century theories of social evolution, racism. The natural byproduct now had a quote-unquote scientific basis, and as such became an integral part of education itself. This is why Western anthropologists have played the dominant role in shaping African history, which, from their viewpoint, was the study of primitive peoples. The migrations, as we have seen, served their purpose well. The imperialists with the pen. The picture becomes clear, however, when we know that the Black migrations were not always all Black. Some of these were Afro-Asians, some had a few white Asians, other groups were entirely Afro-Berber or Afro-Arab. These often tended to form an independent ethnic group keeping to themselves. There were also some of the groups of Berbers and later Arabs who migrated from the Sahara to favorable locations in the interior. So, as stated above, since we are here considering the earliest migrations from the Sahara to find Caucasoid remains in any part of Africa today is really without any particular significance. Such finds obviously do not justify the conclusions reached by many writers. So because they at the time were finding all of these white remains in the interior and in odd places away from the coast of Africa, they wanted to say that one white person that they found was representative of the people that lived there, even though that one set of white remains could have been surrounded by hundreds of African remains. They wanted to pick out and pluck out the one white one. But these experts on Africa are not ignorant of the essential facts and outcomes of migrations. This is certainly true of those who have studied the dispersions and the mixings of peoples over the millenniums. They know, but there is apparently a deeply felt need, an urgent and almost desperate compulsion to justify the power position of the white world over the non-white peoples. That white power is so all-encompassing makes the task of Western scholarship in particular easy enough. First of all, they are not only supported by the almost limitless wealth amassed from the exploited peoples of the earth, but they also still control, directly or indirectly, the economic life of every Black state today. Well, at the time of this writing. Hopefully that's changing now with the happenings in Niger and in Nigeria. This is equally true of numerous non-African countries, still poor and begging, while their wealth is being drained off to the already rich countries. Secondly, they control world education and science. Scholarship supported by billions of dollars, far from being independent and objective, has generally served its masters well, becoming arrogant and overbearing in the process. Their most powerful weapon is a single word: science. Having successfully raised science far above religion in the faith of people generally, they may now present almost any proposition and conclude as scientific and gain wide acceptance. The age has paused when men listened with reverence when it was declared that thus saith the Lord. Now one simply has to say, according to science, or most scholars are agreed, etc. Finally, the universities spearheaded the final economic triumph of the West over the rest of the world. Science pushed the partnership of big corporate wealth and big government into exciting fields of inventions and discoveries. Weapons of universal destruction actually outdistanced the technology of time and space. Who then could question white supremacy? Who dared to challenge viewpoints held by scholars with this awesome array of power behind them? Certainly, nothing coming from the Blacks required any serious consideration. The mind transplant had been most successful as an operation on the Blacks. Having lost the honor of full manhood that comes only from the pride of racial worth and identity, the Black man's mind generally operates favorably towards his white enemies and negatively toward himself and his kind. No one knows this better than the whites. They have therefore had a free and unchallenged hand in reordering the land of the Blacks as they saw fit, classifying and naming people, places, and things just as they pleased. The Blacks were non-persons or nobodies in their own land. From one end of the continent to the other, Black youth saw great monuments and statues of Europeans only. European and Arab names for African roads, hills, lakes, towns, and cities. One youngster, whose ancestors had migrated from the north centuries ago, stood gazing at a statue of Cecil Rhodes. "He's in our school books too," he proudly informed his parents. The smile left as he asked, "But why are our great men forgotten? We never hear about them." As none could answer, there was silence. This particular group belonged to a family that was 2,000 miles from their known original home. This refers to the place that oral tradition declares to be the original home. But we know that the place of origin, often given in the oral record, means the place where the group lived for so many generations that previous home sites during these long drawn-out migrations had been forgotten. What they had forgotten, however, was less tragic than their ignorance of some of the well-known facts of their more recent history as a people. The boy raised an important question. They could not answer because they are Blacks of Rhodesia. What little history they knew was white Rhodesian history, and this they could learn from Rhodes to Ian Smith. They did not know that they had been living for generations in the center of what was once one of the greatest Black empires in Africa, nor had they ever heard the great African leader of that empire, Emperor Mutota, As elsewhere, Rhodesian history began with the coming of the whites. All before that is unknown prehistory. To the caves, to the swamps. We have been studying those people who were actually migrating from a highly advanced civilization to less advanced regions or regions not advanced at all, but who continued to rebuild new states until they were destroyed by the European invasions. Since a representative number of these states appear in the following pages, a final word should be said about the vast numbers who found only caves and swamps of places as places of refuge, and therefore built no states, but sank lower and lower in hopelessness, ever-present fears of capture, and a life that was not life, but an animal-like struggle to survive. I referred to these before, but all too briefly. They are an inseparable part of the history of the race. Their savage state enables us to measure the distance from the heights to the level where so many of the race have fallen. It also may be the bold recognition on our part that serves as a guidelight on the road back to greatness. Call them savages if that pleases you. But these were the blacks in retreat before the slave hunters. These were the blacks who had to choose between enslavement for life and that of all their descendants and freedom. They did not hesitate. They chose freedom even though it meant the loss of a civilization which they had in fact already lost. To be slaves of Arabs, Europeans, or Americans simply meant becoming the economic foundation for their civilization and the steady destruction of the civilization of the blacks. So all hail the black savages, those noble ancestors who chose both freedom and death in the presence of white enslavement. Freedom and death. Once the paths they made in flight could be followed for days by their bloody footprints in the sand. The wind-blown sand had easily covered these up. Later travelers and slave hunters could determine the various routes of flight by the skeletons found there and fallen statues left by those who could not make it on. They were generally disjointed and scattered. Sometimes it was a bony arm protruding from the windswept sands, a leg over there, or a skull seemingly to smile, peace at last. The bones of other thousands who died in flight were never seen. They lay buried forever under the tons of sand and rocks that moved over much of the regions. Masses of blacks found security in the hills that were made inaccessible to both Arabs and Europeans. Such were blacks who isolated themselves in the stronghold of the Nuba Hills. They were never conquered, throwing back all invading army units that attempted subjugation and enslavement. Westerners point to their primitive state, to their nude and half-nude bodies. To the somewhat twisted Western mind, nakedness in public was indicative of the savage. The twisted mind becomes evident when the same people do not find it necessary to explain the universality of white nudist colonies or naked bodies, not to mention sexual intercourse on public stages and screens. Reference to the Noba people, of course, is simple to give still another example of people who had to make the grim choice between freedom and slavery, choosing freedom even when that choice meant isolation and inevitably retrogression. Blacks, who were among the very first weavers and cloth makers on earth, could no longer wear clothes. These flights, before the mighty firepower of the invaders became more general after 400 AD, even though guns, after 200 years of development, were still not in widespread use in Africa. Only Europeans and Arabs were able to secure a limited supply of these precious and certain to conquer weapons. The blacks had nothing of the kind. Meanwhile, experimentation to improve various types of gunnery and speed up production was frantically pushed. The successful outcome of this great venture in firepower was the prelude to the Industrial Revolution that was to change not only the material world, but what was left of the humane nature of man himself. So the coming of the gun took away and eroded the last bits and vestiges of humanity that were a part of man himself. It is not likely that the people were then generally aware that they were being slowly hemmed in from all directions. It is possible that many did feel it without having any exact knowledge of being encircled, although the danger might be several hundred miles away where the hostile seas met the friendly land. Other groups of wandering blacks headed for dismal swamps. Others dug caves in the hills. There were also those who wandered aimlessly out into the scorching desert and died with their babies strapped to their backs and larger children clutching them by the hand. This meant that the bleached skeletons of little babies and children greeted the eyes as though additional testimony were needed to show how many of the young were included among those who would not make it even to barbarism. All of those who survived in these various groups ended up in areas where they could do little more than survive. Even if they had not splintered off into small independent societies, famine and disease would have reduced their numbers anyway. Therefore, as noted elsewhere, there were many firmly united groups that were so large that migrating as a single unit was impossible. Here, the very circumstances of the case demanded separation, estrangement, and isolation from the mother society, and the eventual development of several new language groups. The disunity among the blacks that spread over the whole race often developed from crisis situations over which they had no control in the awful struggle to survive. The millions who found security only in places of extreme isolation, in the caves and swamps, in around a few precious waterholes in the desert, and on inaccessible hills. None of these people were favored with the chance of even to begin the building of their lost civilization. Far from being ashamed of them as savages, this chapter is a salute to them, a salute with pride that says to them, all honor and all glory. Unlike the blacks we most know about, they could not build great kingdoms and empires. Many were far removed even from the fringes of an advancing world. Yet they overrode the unceasing attacks of both death and hell and survived. What is more, they held fast the last line of freedom on the African continent, and they held it against cannon fire to the very end. Even when colonialism swept over their land, they were never conquered. They have been wise enough to see both Islam and Christianity as just another route to the slavery they had fought and died to avoid. They remained steadfast in their own religion and therefore were called pagans, but all of their children were born free, none in Muslim or Christian slavery, and their girls were never dragged off to become slaves in the harems of Arabs or as breeding girls for white men in the West. Finally, I referred to blacks who, though forced to move, never left their homeland region. The Noba did not move very far from where they had lived from times immemorial. A far greater number of blacks held on in their ancient center as it was overrun, refusing either to leave or be enslaved. They stayed and battled against the invaders, finally being concentrated in the southern provinces of the Sudan, where the earlier history of the race in Egypt is still being repeated, line by line. And this is why it is so easy to understand the history of the blacks and see very clearly how they were not only forced far back behind the advancing races, but also pushed to the lowest levels of degradation. For that history is still being made today, covertly and openly for all the world to see. The blacks, who are under pressure today in Bahr el Ghazal, Upper Nile, Equatoria, are still fighting for survival against the all-conquering colored Arabs to this day. Just as their forefathers fought 5,000 years ago from the Mediterranean and Lower Egypt to where they are now making a last stand. Romantic history? Who needs it? They have been massacred by the hundreds and villages left in ashes, but they fight on. This all-black region is kept isolated and cut off from the developments and higher levels of life seen in the Arab-dominated Sudan. The Southern Sudanese have remained, even in 1973, both primitive and pagan, just as their brothers elsewhere had to remain under similar circumstances. It was still the hunting ground for slaves. The blacks had to remain sharply alert at all times, for the modern slave traffic was covert, subtle, and often highly sophisticated. There were no outright raids. The slave agents may appear as employment offices, seeking workers or representatives of schools offering free training for nurses, teachers, and various trades. I was told when I was working in this area that these tactics were successful for a long time because of the extreme poverty and the desperate need for jobs. The fighting that has been going on constantly for 15 years has caused the same kind of migrations as most of those already described. Thousands have been migrating into a country that allowed them to enter. Even in this modern age, many will never see those left behind again. They will scatter and settle among other people wherever they can. They will become the lost in the merger, while their brothers and sisters stay behind and carry on the ancient tradition of fighting on against overwhelming odds as long as they can stand. In this study, you must have noticed that the past and present are joined. We study our past for the express purpose of learning what things made the race great in the past, what explains subsequent failures and weaknesses, and what, in light of that history, can we do now if we have the will. This is what the study of history should mean for African people in particular. This chapter on the migrations, for example, tells us much that is even alarmingly crucial. But how many of us care to grapple with the real significance? Who asked, why is it that the Black world, forever uptight over South Africa and Rhodesia, has remained silent about the 15 years of slaughter of Blacks in the Sudan? I asked 4 leaders of the resistance if the southern provinces had ever appealed to the Organization of African Unity for help. We have been begging them ever since it started, was the unanimous reply. Not for arms, but just to use this influence to stop burning our villages and the massacre of our people. But you see, the white and brown Arabs actually control the policies of the OAU. For us, that means that they still control the blacks of Africa. Meanwhile, migrants still wonder, as of old, for them freedom and independence are yet to come to Africa. And that is the end of chapter 7. As you can see, we learned that if you control the economy of a place and a people, you effectively control the people. Because if I can't get my goods and services out to the larger world without going through you, or if I don't have the connection, if I don't have the network, my net worth is going to continue to stay low. We also see that the OAU and all of these wonderful organizations that have been built up are often controlled by the mulatto class. And that does not serve African people because they are silent on the suffering of the blacks. So if they are silent on the suffering of the blacks, then what good are they of these people? We come from a people that fought back. We come from a people that would rather flee into the unknown than sit there and be amalgamated and integrated into a society that is destined to put us and our children on the bottom. If you love Black people, you will continue to flee to Africa. You will fight to protect your family and re-engage your family line. You will continue to teach the history that you know and learn the history that you don't. And you will continue to love Black people. Well, guys, that's all I got for tonight. I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we review the resurrection and the life case studies by states, which is chapter 8. I appreciate each and every one of you. I want to thank you for my cash apps. I want to thank Sister Raw. I want to thank the forecast. I want to thank Brother Bakari. I want to thank Koku and Oni Tase for shouting me out in all of their programs. I appreciate you. Peace, guys.